Hi, and welcome to episode 70 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada.
I'm Tom Housley, and I'm working at the University of Cambridge in the UK.
Yeah, and this week we're joined by Dr. Emily Burdfield-Steel, who's a postdoc currently at the University of Jyvaskyla in Finland, which is probably not even close to being correct to how to pronounce that name, but we're going to run with it and not say it ever again. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Emily.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure.
So yes, I'm a new postdoc at the University of Jyvaskyla, which, to be fair, is spelt nothing like it said.
There's silent letters in there like crazy.
Too many letters. That's the problem with Finnish. So I'm currently studying color polymorphism in aposematic moths, and specifically what I'm looking at is I'm studying a species called wood tiger moths that have chemical defense fluids which they use to protect themselves against predators, and these vary a lot within the species, so I'm studying like the variation within the species of these chemical defenses, and also just trying to figure out what chemicals they actually use and what pathways these can be used to produce these. And my PhD work was at the University of St Andrews, where I studied reproductive interference, which is when animals try and mate with the wrong species.
So I think we should delve straight into the reproductive interference thing, particularly because I think the first time that we met you gave a talk where you showed an amazing picture of a fur seal trying to hump a penguin. So tell us more about reproductive interference.
Okay, so reproductive interference, basically it includes any sort of mating interactions between species. So that can include like courtship and signaling and actual mating attempts, as in the seal on penguin incident. There's actually a paper on that. You can look up the paper. There's 45-minute observations of a male fur seal trying to have sex with a penguin.
Wow, that's pretty good going.
It's one of my favorite things ever, I've got to say. I use that photo whenever I can. But what actually makes something reproductive interference as opposed to just a hilarious story is that this has to impose a cost on one or both species. So in order for it to be reproductive interference, there has to be a cost. So in some cases, like if you're a seal and if you're a penguin rather and a seal's tried to have sex with you, you can assume there's probably a cost there. I think in the paper they said that afterwards the seal swam away and the penguin lay on the ground but looked around, so it was still alive, but apparently in some form of shock.
As one would expect.
Yeah, so there's a cost. But what I actually was studying was in seed bugs. And there we were looking more at costs in terms of harassment costs to females and lost mating opportunities by males that are trying to like mate with the wrong species. And also, more generally, I was just looking at what the study of something like reproductive interference can tell you both about sort of the evolution of the mating system that's occurring in, so what it can tell you about how animals are normally trying to choose mates, and also if just looking at whether the selection against this is going to be strong enough to have any other effects. So could avoidance of reproductive interference be really shaping mating systems in some cases?
So why wouldn't there be stronger selection against this kind of thing if you're missing reproductive opportunities? Then,
So that's a really good question. Part of the reason would be that we always expect there's going to be some selection against this behaviour, because even if it doesn't carry any costs, it's unlikely to carry any benefits, except in very specific cases. So just to go into some of the cases where it could have a positive effect is in some species you have this sort of observation effect on sexual selection. So I don't know if you've heard in some lekking birds, like if females see a male mating, then they'll think he's higher quality and be more likely to mate with him. And it seems like similar things happen in some fish. So in that case, you could say maybe even mating with the wrong species will be enough to make other females around think that you're a better potential mate. But that's a very unusual circumstance. Normally it's going to have no benefit. But if the costs of it are fairly low, then developing or evolving barriers against this behavior might actually impose more costs than the behavior itself. So say you're a bug and you're trying to mate with other species, okay, you could become you could have better discrimination. You could be choosier about your mates. But then you might lose out on matings with your own species because you're being choosier, or you might have to spend more time evaluating mates and things like that. So, and that seemed to be the case with the bugs I was studying, that the males, their best mating strategy was to just try and mate with every female they came across. And if that meant that they were trying to mate with the wrong female occasionally, well...
C'est la vie.
Exactly.
So what does this mean for things like speciation and hybridization if the males are still quite happy to just go for everything they see?
And I can't really comment on that because I'm not really an expert on the whole speciation by reinforcement thing, which is where you have the hybrids coming in and they have lower fitness, and therefore you develop barriers against hybridization to combat this. The only thing you can really take from my research with regards to the speciation question is that there's going to be other things influencing pre-reproductive isolation barriers, not just avoidance of hybrids. So it's not just a case of like, oh, make sure you pick the right species. In order to do that, you either have to create new mechanisms. You have to either separate your choosing a good quality mate from choosing a different species, or you're just going to do the normal thing of you're just going to run the risk of turning down potentially beneficial matings or having to take more time choosing who you're going to mate with and things like that.
So did you also look at in your research sort of different mate qualities as well as different species and see how males and females reacted?
We didn't actually try and directly look at sort of quality, partly because in the bugs I was studying we weren't really sure what counted as a good quality mate. So one of the other guys working in the same lab as me was looking more at this, and it seems like, as with a lot of insects, the males prefer slightly larger females, and there seems to be a benefit to males of being slightly smaller with longer legs, but they had quite a forceful mating system, so there wasn't really any courtship. Males would jump on females. There was a lot of sexual conflict, and it seemed like they didn't have particularly strong mating preferences in the first place, especially not the males, which is probably why they showed such high levels of reproductive interference. They just weren't that picky.
So how common are they in the wild? Like, would it be a scenario where the species that you're working on, the seed bugs, where they wouldn't come across another individual or perhaps any female of any species very often, and so they take the opportunity while they've got it? Or are they just super common and just horny as all hell?
The thing about them is, so I was working on 5 different species, although I had one focal species, and they're found like all across Europe. But their population densities vary a lot, and they vary between years. So at like my field site, some years you'd find like loads of one species, like you'd find literally hundreds of them in like aggregations along riverbeds and things like that. You would just, the whole place was covered in them. And then you'd find 6 of the other species in a 2-mile square radius. So, but then the next year it would be different. There'd be different species were in high abundance, or they'd be in a different area. So I think the thing that my bugs really encounter in the wild is just very unpredictable, like densities and circumstances. Sometimes it could be very, very easy to find loads of mates. You'd be tripping over them. Other times you'd have to fly long distances to find any. And in some areas, very closely related species overlap, and in some areas they don't. So it's just very variable.
So I also wanted to ask about, you did some more research on another exciting area of weird insect sex, where you did a paper on sexual cannibalism. So can you tell us about what prompted you to do this paper?
Yeah, that was a really fun paper. So that was basically inspired by a paper that came out slightly before it in Animal Behaviour, that was looking at papers on sexual conflict, and then looking at the words used to describe male and female traits in papers on sexual conflict, and then ranking those words as either passive, active, reactive, or neutral. And they found that female traits overwhelmingly got described with the reactive words, and male traits were described with the active words. So this was basically suggesting that there's like a cultural influence, looking at females as more passive and males as more active in driving these like co-evolutionary cycles. So that was really cool. But the one criticism that you could make of that paper is that perhaps that was just describing what was really happening. There's no way of saying whether all the male traits are getting the active words because of a cultural bias or because that's just how it is in the wild. So we came up with the idea of looking at one particularly extreme case of sexual conflict, which is sexual cannibalism. Because in the original paper, no sexual cannibalism papers had been included. And in sexual cannibalism, it is almost always the females that are eating the males. So we thought, okay, we'll do the same thing they did. We'll look at the sexual cannibalism literature. And if by some weird chance we're finding reactive words for the females there, then we know something is definitely up because it's the females that are doing this behavior. And so we did that. We went through the top 40 most cited papers, I think, which were mostly on spiders, but then we tried to find some others on different species as well. And thankfully we found that the females were getting the active words in those papers. But we also found, which we weren't really expecting, that a lot of those words were quite negative. So they were described as aggressive and voracious, and on one paper, rapacious, which is a good word. But very loaded words for describing animal behavior. And words that really seem to be making kind of these, I don't want to say moral judgments, but kind of the femme fatale black widow kind of stereotype was coming through a little bit in some of these papers. So that was really interesting. Yeah,
rapacious is maybe not a particularly quantitative descriptor to be using in a scientific paper.
Exactly, right? And whether or not, they're cool words, it makes it sound exciting, but they do have, they're quite loaded, They have associations with them that are perhaps not fair to the animals.
So do you think part of this is people just trying to sex up their papers to make them more likely to get picked up by the mainstream media?
Possibly. I mean, I don't think that's the main driver, though, because some of these papers were quite old, and a lot of them, they were for other people working in the same area. It wasn't obvious that they were written sort of with press releases in mind. I think part of it's just repetition. Someone uses a term once, you just keep using it. And yeah, part of it is just because it's fun to write with these words. They're very descriptive words. They give you a very vivid picture of what's happening. It's just perhaps that picture isn't 100% accurate.
I liked it. I saw one of the quotes from you in, I think it was the IO9 website, talking about how the male spider is often seen as making a noble sacrifice, but to him just being a spider.
The male's got these amazing words like sacrifice and suicide. I mean, it's again they're very evocative, but it's a spider. And the spider commits suicide, really? And sacrifice is like, it makes it sound very almost kind of noble. But either it's trying desperately to get away and it's being eaten against its will, or it's allowing itself to be eaten because that will increase its fitness. Both of those are selfish actions.
It's not like it had tennis plans that afternoon anyways, so...
Well, so, especially in spiders, some of them can't mate more than once or twice, so at a certain point they're like, just eat me.
Going out while I'm on top, or rather not. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting paper, and showed off a little bit of how scientists like to say that we're super unbiased and such, but we let it creep in some unusual ways from time to time, but maybe without even noticing it and applying our own. Like you said, it's hard to say whether it was moral judgments on it, but in some cases it certainly seemed that way. Do you know? I mean, maybe this is beyond the scope of the study at all, but do you know what the sex ratio was of the authors who are writing these papers?
We had a quick look at that, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think they were not massively male biased. I think there might have been a male bias in last authors, which is not very surprising. It was also slightly skewed by the fact that we just picked the top 40 most cited, or we took the top 30 most cited, and then took others based on the fact that if they were if they'd used different systems, because we didn't want to be entirely 2 or 3 species of spider. And that meant that actually we were getting a lot of papers by the same groups, or the same sort of groups of people. So, you know, people who clearly worked in each other's labs and things like that, which might have been throwing that off a bit. But it wasn't, I don't remember it being like hugely male biased. I think, you know, by the standards of biology at the moment, there was the normal number of women.
as abysmal as that may be at this point. Well, that's interesting. So did you hear back from any of the researchers who were, you know, brought up in the study? Have you contacted them at all or heard from them at conferences and whatever about what they may have thought about you, not so much critiquing, but at least noting the style of their writing and the words they've chosen?
I don't think I heard back personally from anyone that we included. I did get sent a few different papers on sexual cannibalism and also honeybees by people after that came out, which was really cool. And I did speak to some people at conferences who were just like, this is just silly. Soon there'll be a tiny list of words we can use. We won't be allowed to use any. But to be fair, I mean, our point wasn't to say, like, this is wrong and these people shouldn't use these words, although I will make a case against the word rapacious. But that was only used once, and I can't remember which paper it was in, so I'm sorry if the others are watching.
Google Scholar search for rapacious. I'm sure you'll bring up that single paper.
Yeah. But, I mean, the problem we had is even amongst my co-authors, we couldn't agree on whether we wanted to say this was definitely something people should stop doing or not, because the problem with language is different words mean different things to different people. You can't get too technical or the papers just become almost unreadable. It's like, then the male moved in a direction that was away from the female and things like that. So, you know, if anyone did want to contact me, I hope they wouldn't feel attacked, because that wasn't the idea at all. It was just an interesting thing that came out of it that we didn't expect to find, and is worth thinking about. Even if you think about it and then decide, okay, I'm still going to use this word, I think sometimes it's a good idea to think more carefully about the language you're using, because these things slip in and you don't notice it happening. So if someone wants to make a conscious decision to use some of these words, I'm not going to argue with them for that. I just think it needs to be conscious.
That's a good point. It's interesting, though, because, you know, scientists are regularly called out for the way that they write, especially in their scientific papers, and how usually dry and boring and craptacular it is. But it's interesting to see, you know, pretty much the other end of the spectrum, where they're applying very colorful language in some regards to their study subjects. I'm not sure there is any, I don't know, maybe somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, I guess, but...
That's the point, right? Whatever you do, you're going to be criticized by someone. Either, like, I'm going to be standing there going, oh, you can't use those words. Or someone's going to be trying to read your paper going, this is the most boring thing I've ever seen in my life. So that's why I'm aware of the fact that it's not there's no easy answers.
Just like the rest of science, I suppose.
I know.
All right, well, maybe we should move on to your, away from sex and towards your current work. I was listening to your podcast earlier, which you can tell us about later, but your sister described your current work as you collecting moth farts.
Why? That's totally incorrect. Spreading. No. So as I said, my moths produce 2 different defensive fluids. One's from glands on the back of their necks, and one's from the abdomen. Because these moths, once they emerge as adults, they don't eat anymore. So they still have some fluids in their abdomen from when they were larvae. And so some of these are probably waste fluids, but then there's also something in there that makes it distasteful to invertebrate predators and possibly other predators as well. So in order to collect my samples, I simulate an attack on the moths, which is like a fancy way of saying I squeeze them with tweezers until they release their defensive fluid.
I was really hoping that it was going to involve you in a bird costume, just kind of swooping towards.
If someone gets me a bird costume, I will happily do my lab work wearing it.
I will get you a bird costume.
That would be amazing.
Consider it done.
Great costume. That would work. No, just the tweezers.
So these fluids, is it something that they synthesize from the host plants that they're feeding on as larvae, or something else?
That's a good question. It seems no. The plants they feed on as larvae do often contain substances that are often used in chemical defenses, but it seems not in theirs. So they have this potential source of protective chemicals, and they're not using it. And instead, they're using something totally different, and we don't know what it is or how they're making it. So that's one of the reasons I'm collecting so much of the fluids at the moment, is because we're still in the stage of trying to work out what's in them. Like, what is that? What are the biologically relevant components? What's affecting the predators? And we don't know yet. So I'm collecting huge numbers of huge amounts of fluid from a lot of moths and sending it off to some collaborators in Germany. So hopefully I'll have an answer to that sometime soon.
Cool. So are these moths, are they color polymorphic as well?
Yeah, so they vary in color around their range. But the most interesting thing about them is the males have this like discrete color polymorphism, and you can get males from the same locality that are either have yellow or white hindwings. And this is, it's quite striking color difference. And when they rest on trees and things, they show their hindwings. So this is on display to predators. And then other people working in this lab previously have shown through like use of models, like little paper models, that predators in most areas seem to avoid the yellow ones more than the white ones. So there seems to be an advantage to the yellow ones in terms of predation, but then the white ones still persist. They're still there. So the whole focus of the lab group I'm in really is like, why have they not all become one color? Because, if they're trying to teach predators to avoid them, having two colors just seems really silly.
So are these day-flying moths, or are these night-flying moths that just hang out on trees and stuff and try and make it through the daylight hours by showing off their...
They're day-flying.
Oh, okay, so they're day-flying.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Because I'm familiar with a couple other tiger moths over here in Canada and such that have got nighttime defenses where color doesn't do you any good at all, but they've got their ultrasonic defenses against bats and such, whether they're jamming or whether they're an aposematic, stay away from me, I taste like crap kind of thing. So it's interesting to hear that similar ideas are going on with their day flying cousins as well.
Yeah, it's very cool.
So is the group looking at the whole kind of what's happening to the moths, what's happening to the predators, how are they co-evolving, and kind of everything in the system?
It's a massive group, so we've got people working on like the genetic side, looking at gene flow between the populations. We've got people looking at the frequency-dependent selection, because it seems like there's definitely some kind of frequency dependence going on with the two colors. We've got people working on the sexual selection, so like which color has an advantage when it comes to mating and why. And then I come in looking at the more chemical side, so hoping to find out what the chemicals are, and then if there could be trade-offs involved in their production that might be driving this, and looking at how honest the signaling is, because it looks like the yellow ones, as well as having the stronger signal, also have stronger chemical defenses. But we're still like teasing all that stuff apart at the moment.
So is it fully genetically determined whether they're yellow or white morphs?
There's definitely a genetic component. People in the lab are still trying to figure out exactly how it's inherited, because it's not a clear Mendelian thing or anything like that. It's nothing that easy, unfortunately.
Typical.
Yeah. And we try and breed lines where they're definitely going to be one color or the other, and then you'll have like a whole bunch of families that are like, these ones should all be white, and you're like, this one's yellow.
Jerks.
Yep.
So to kind of blur the lines here, we're really sure that these are all the same species, right? And that you don't have something that you worked on with your PhD where you've got, two cryptic species that may or may not be, interbreeding among one another and be separating out that way.
They are definitely the same species. They've done quite a lot of genetic work now. And the other thing is that there were other color morphs, like red, for example, that were found in other areas that they initially thought were like a subspecies, but then the genetics just says, nope, they're all the same. There's very little genetic differentiation between any of the populations, and definitely not enough to be, causing this polymorphism.
So how do the red ones fit in? Are they even more harsh to the predators than the yellow ones?
We don't know. So they're only found sort of down in Georgia. So okay. I think the lab's been working on that population for a couple of years now, but we don't have them in the lab. I think we're just trying to get some in the lab, and we just don't know as much about them. So we don't know.
Cool. All right, I think we're coming towards the close here, but we mentioned earlier that you have your own podcast starting up, so maybe you should tell us all about that.
You're overhyping it. My sister's currently studying for a PhD in film and TV studies, so we thought it would be a really fun idea if we started our own podcast where we try and explain basically what we do to each other, like what our research is to each other, and also then talk about things that we think are cool in our various areas, thus potentially doubling our very, very narrow target audience for both those subjects. And it's called Not Those Kind of Doctors, and so far we've done one episode which was mostly giggling. But we're going to try and do another one this Friday with less giggling and more content. So
good luck. I'm pretty sure our first 7 episodes were mostly us giggling and me swearing.
Yep, that's pretty much it. Emily, where can people follow along with your research and with Not Those Kinds of Doctors as well?
Probably the best place would either follow me on Twitter, which is moth postdoc, at moth postdoc, or on my blog, which is bug behavioral ecology at wordpress.com, and everything just goes up on there.
Awesome. Well, we will be sure to put links to all of those, as well as the papers that we've discussed in this episode, up on our blog, which I mentioned earlier, was at breakingbio.com, along with the show notes for today. As well as you can follow us on Twitter at Breaking Bio. You can also find us on Facebook by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast. I think that's just about it for this week, but I'd like to thank Emily very much for talking to us about all of her diverse research, and see you all again soon.